Good evening. Thank you. I'm Christopher Thompson, and I am professor of moral theology here at the St. Paul Seminary School of Divinity, and tonight serving in the great honor as co-director of the Murphy Institute, along with my colleague Lisa Schiltz, who is in the room here somewhere. I don't see Lisa at the moment. And tonight is a presentation that's the fruit of a collaboration of several different groups here in the university. I'm very, very excited about that, including the Institute for Theological Formation at the St. Paul Seminary, the Office of Sustainability Initiatives here at the University of St. Thomas, the Anselm House at the University of Minnesota, getting its own shout-out. That's pretty nice planning on Anselm's part. That's pretty impressive. Anselm House at the University of Minnesota, and the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota as well. I'm really excited about the collaboration of those communities coming together on this important topic. So thanks to all of those organizations for chipping in. The diversity of contributors only serves to highlight the vitality of the issues we are talking about tonight. And it's a special privilege of the Institute, Murphy Institute, to serve as convener of tonight's conversation. We do want to thank you, each of you, our panelists in particular, for contributing. Before we begin, let me just offer a few comments by way of context. In 2015, Pope Francis issued an encyclical, Laudato Si, in which he called upon every person on the planet, that's you, and the Catholic community in particular, to give special attention to the care of creation and the stewardship of the earth's resources, especially as they relate to the honoring of God and the care of the poor. In a brief section, he touched upon important ethical questions surrounding the use of biological technologies, especially as they impact our approach to what we're calling here tonight lower creation, that is the non-human animal and plant world. We're going to be talking about that segment of the community. All such use and experimentation, he says, requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. And it's precisely this religious respect for the integrity of creation that's the point of departure for tonight's presentation. How does respect for creation, and by implication the respect for the human community which relies on it, how do we conduct ourselves in a measured, prudent, and maybe even exercise restraint when it comes to such technologies? If we couple Pope Francis's practical admonition with our own Christian convictions that sees the earth and its creatures as divine works of art, following Aquinas in that regard, then it's not only important but essential that we take time to develop a set of values that might guide a protocol concerning genetic research and the manipulation of creatures. Thomas Aquinas saw the world of created beings as a cosmos filled with light, each creature brimming with a brilliance almost too great for the human mind to fully fathom. The greatest philosopher, he says at one point, can't penetrate the meaning of a single fly. Each of us dwell in a universe created by God to be a gift to us, a joyful mystery, an occasion of wonder and praise. It's in light of these values that we begin to understand that our use of creation, especially when it concerns the manipulation of its very structures and its natural purposes, calls for a certain restraint, and that such an enterprise ought not to be undertaken except in deliberate deference to the order and wisdom of creation of which the creature is a part, with utmost care and prudent circumspection, when proportionate goods are clearly identified and reasonably expected, and all other reasonable alternatives have been considered, including the modification of our lifestyles. Because each creature is granted a certain kind of standing within creation, a proportionate good would have to be articulated before we proceed to modify the circumstances of any creature's dwelling. It's not a matter of implementing mere risk assessment protocols, which tend to focus on outcomes and consequences, but of making a prior, deeper commitment to creatures as given, a certain preferential option for creatures as having positive worth in the overall scheme of things. Even if no significant impact is anticipated in light of one's proposed action, there remains the positive obligation to consider whether any action ought to be undertaken in the first place. What is the proportionate good intended to be achieved? Are there other non-interventionist, natural ways of achieving similar outcomes? Can such outcomes be achieved through a more equitable distribution of goods and resources, socially, for example? Or is the proportionate good of genetic modification merely the perpetuation of a disordered consumption on the part of a few? These are complex environmental issues, Francis says in Laudato Si', and they call for a comprehensive approach, which would require great effort to develop various lines of independent, interdisciplinary research capable of shedding new light on the problem. It's that commitment to interdisciplinary, independent research that drives tonight's conversation. And let me say again what a privilege it is to serve as co-director of the Murphy Institute and contribute to the common good of the UST community in this regard. Our first speaker, Father Nicanor Austriaco, is a member of the Eastern Province of the Order of Preachers. Father Nicanor completed his bachelor's degree in bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania and then earned his PhD in biology from MIT, where he was a fellow at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. He was ordained a priest in the Order of Preachers, same order of St. Thomas Aquinas, in May of 2004. He completed his pontifical license in sacred theology, in moral theology, at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. In 2005, he earned a pontifical doctorate in sacred theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Father Austriaco currently serves as professor of biology and theology and is director of ThomisticeVolution.org at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. He's a research fellow at the Center for Religious Studies and Ethics at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, Philippines. His NIH-funded laboratory at Providence College is investigating the genetics of programmed cell death using the selected yeasts as modeled organisms. He gave the titles of those yeasts in his papers, but I'm not going to try to pronounce them. They're just selected yeasts. Papers describing his research have been published in some of the leading research journals, including the Journal of Cell Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences. And in philosophy and theology, his essays have been published in National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, Nova et Vetera, The Thomist, Science and Theology, and the Linacre Quarterly. It's an extraordinary record of accomplishment and contribution to the common good, and it's an extraordinary privilege to introduce Father Nicanor Austriaco.
So you're going to have to excuse me. I don't like talking behind a podium. I'm a professor, so I'm just going to get in front of a lecture hall, and I'm going to talk. So I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Christopher Thompson for the kind invitation, not only to come to the university to give this presentation, but honestly to invite me to think about these questions for the first time. So I am a bioethicist, and this is the first time I've ever been asked to speak about CRISPR with regards to lower creation. So whenever I get involved with CRISPR, and I'm involved with CRISPR a lot right now, we're usually dealing with the bioethics of human gene editing and designer babies in China. So that's like the hot thing right now. And in fact, I'm in conversations with the 3 CRISPR companies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to try to figure out whether or not there's a consensus amongst Christians with regards to the morality of germline gene therapy. But this is going to be a work in progress. My talk this evening is going to be a work in progress. It's me trying to process what I know as a bioethicist, applying principles to human ethics, in this case to animal technology, to try to understand how we can move forward, especially in light of Laudato Si'. So my talk today is going to be made up of 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about science, because I'm not quite sure how many of you are aware of CRISPR and what CRISPR can do and why we're even here talking about the future of CRISPR. Then we're going to talk about ethics, and I have a few minutes just to give you a sense of the landscape, the ethical landscape, in which we need to maneuver animal ethics vis-a-vis human ethics. And then one of the things that I'm really intrigued about is trying to talk about the virtues. So as Dr. Thompson pointed out, I'm a Dominican in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas. And so one of the things that is the hallmark of a Thomistic ethics is an account of the virtues that shapes the character of the agent, the human agent. And so the question here that I want to ask is, are there particular virtues that we can inculcate in a genetic engineer who is a Christian, a believer, or someone who has a deep respect for creation, so that he or she will be able to properly maneuver and resist what people have called the technological imperative. So that's really what I'm going to try to do in a few minutes. So first, we're going to talk about the science. So we're talking about gene editing, and so I need to begin with the nature of the gene and just talk about DNA. And so this is a slide I use when I teach Bio 103, which is the first semester of the introductory freshman course in biology at Providence College. And so here you've got the nuclear genome. Most of you have seen these really cool pictures of chromosomes. What you may not realize is that there's also a part of the genome that is not found in the nucleus. The nucleus is kind of like central command for the cell, and that's the mitochondria. We're not going to really be talking about that today. So if you take one of these chromosomes, and if I ask one of the pre-meds here, like Joe in the back there, and I ask Joe, how many chromosomes are there in the human being? He's going to tell you what, Joe? There we go. So there's 46, 23 pairs, right? And so if you take one of the chromosomes and you stretch them out, what you're going to do is you actually end up with the iconic DNA molecule. So when you think of these chromosomes, they're just an incredibly long stretch of DNA. What people don't realize is that if I stretch out your DNA that I find in a single cell, it will stretch out to about 7 feet, which is really striking because the largest cell in the human body is the human egg. And that's the only visible cell that you can actually see with the naked eye. And that's as large as the period at the end of a 12 font times New Times Roman sentence, right? So now you've got to figure out how to take 7 feet of spaghetti and kind of put it into that very teeny bowl in a way that is immediately accessible so that you don't get messed up. And that's really like what biology is going to do for the 21st century. Because we don't know how that works. We don't know how you get this incredibly long piece of spaghetti and organize it in such a way that you can get information, you can access information relatively easily. But if you take this DNA double helix, you can graphically illustrate it in this way. So this is actually DNA. In fact, this is the DNA sequence for the gene that my students and I have been we've spent the last 7 years studying this gene. This gene is BAX inhibitor. It's important for cancer. I'm a cancer biologist primarily. Excuse me. And if you were a molecular biologist, you would see that DNA is a series of letters, A, T, C, G, and each one of them is a particular molecule. And so you have combinations of 4 molecules designated by a letter, C, A, T, G. And a gene has a particular order. So just like in an English sentence, you know that the beginning of the English sentence, it starts right here because there's a capital letter, and it ends with a period. A gene in molecular biology begins with an ATG. If you ever see an ATG, you go, oh, the gene starts right there. And it ends, there are 3 periods. This one is a TAA, there's a TGA, and there's a TGC. So one of the things that an intro bio student does is he or she has to learn how to read the book of life. Now, if you think of this as the book of life, you can think about your genome as 3 billion of these. And what we are able to do now is we're able to change a single letter in the 3 billion 46-volume encyclopedia, which is your genome. That's really what we can do today. And we can do that because of this machine called CRISPR. And CRISPR is a molecular machine. It is made up of 2 parts. One is a protein, just like you have in eggs. And it's called Cas9. And then you've got this RNA. And the RNA targets this cutter to a particular letter in the book. So think about it again. You've got 46 volumes. Each one is a chromosome. You want to change the O to an F in volume 23, page 42, column 4, line 6. We can do that now. And we can go in there with precision and change a single letter in the code. And now you can imagine when this technology was discovered in 2012, a Nobel Prize will be given for it imminently. What it's done is that it's opened up life to engineering. That's really why we're here today. This is why we're talking about the ethics of CRISPR. So it was basically Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley. She discovers it in 2012. We don't have to figure out, I'm not going to have to tell you where we found it. We found it in bacteria. Bacteria use this to defend themselves against viruses. And we took it and we just modified it. We used it as a genetic tool. We can now modify fish and monkeys and plants. And as of last Thanksgiving, we have babies. So we have 2 babies, Lulu and Nana, who were genetically modified in China. This is the guy who modified them. He's in hiding now. I think he's been arrested because it generated so much controversy, not only in China but throughout the world, because he genetically edited these babies. And we understand that there's a 3rd child on the way who's still, there's a pregnancy. So there are basically 3 human beings who were born, 2 have been born, who are for the first time genetically engineered. And they were genetically engineered so that they lack a gene. Well, this is what he says. They lack a gene that HIV needs to infect them. So we can talk about the ethics of that. But with regards to lower creation, this is what people have done already with CRISPR. So CRISPR has been used. So these are the piglets. They are basically genetically modified so they don't get flu. So it turns out that flu devastates piglet populations, porcine populations. And so what happened in last fall is that they were able to knock out the gene that the flu virus needs to infect these pigs. So these pigs are now born resistant to flu. We can also build animal models. So in this particular case, there's this mouse that has a genetic change in its liver so that it mimics human beings with a particular inherited disease. And the idea here is that these mice will now be used as tools to either better understand the biology of the disease or, in the imaginations of more people, to identify new drugs that would be able to help patients with this inherited disease. These are CRISPR pigs. So this is the baby CRISPR pig. And these pigs have been genetically modified so that their organs are now readily transplantable into humans. Right? So the way this works is that the organ that pigs have that we need is their heart. So it turns out that the pig heart physiologically looks like, similar size to a human heart. As you may know, there is a great need for human hearts to be transplanted. And many patients die from lack of receiving a heart. And so this is a group, this is the group this is George Church's group at Harvard. And what they did is they genetically altered the genome of the pig to remove all of the internal viruses that the pig has, so that if a human being received this pig's heart, it would not be infected by pig viruses. Because one of the concerns prior to this editing is that if I took a pig heart and put it into Joe here, Joe would actually get an infection of pig viruses from the heart. And so what they did is they basically went in there and removed, using this genetic tool, they removed every single occurrence of the virus that was latent in the pig genome so that this pig these pigs would now be suitable organ donors for humans. I'm just giving you a landscape before we even talk about the ethics of this. Now, finally, CRISPR is being developed for pest control. So the number one target for this is mosquitoes. So there are 3,000 biological species of mosquitoes in the world. One of them, Anopheles aegypti, is the primary carrier for Zika virus, malaria, you name it. And so there is an effort to use CRISPR to introduce a sterile mutation into the mosquito population to make the entire population sterile to eradicate one particular species of mosquito, right? So this is called a gene drive. Just a few weeks ago, it was published in, I think, Science or Nature, where they're now able to do this in mammals. And so the idea is for rat control, pest control, especially in agriculture and farms, to control pests that they would introduce using CRISPR. They would genetically engineer a mouse or a rat that would mate with the population at large and render the population sterile, basically eviscerating the entire population of pests. So these are all the technologies that we have in place. So now, should we do it? How should we do it? Why should we do it? This is the kind of question. Now, I've spent most of my time as a bioethicist thinking about CRISPR for humans. So it's really interesting now to take what we know from humans and then, especially from the Catholic moral tradition, and apply that ethical framework to animals. So when I teach ethics at Providence College, one of the big distinctions that I make is that there's a difference between a person and a thing, and that how we behave towards persons is very different from the way we behave towards things. And so, for example, this is the personalist principle. A person has no price. You know, I tell my students, how much are you worth? And they go, I don't know. And I go, what would, if I asked your mom, what would she say? I'm priceless, Father. And I go, exactly. That's intrinsic dignity of the human person, made in the image likeness of God. You are priceless. You don't have price, you have dignity. So you don't have a price. We talk about how a person can never be used. He can never be used, he cannot be used merely as a means. He must always be, in a sense, considered as an end. We talk about loving. So you must always, the proper response to a person is love. Whenever you treat a person, you must treat that person with love. If you ever use that person is going to feel manipulated. This week we're talking about the hookup culture in my ethics class, and one of the things that is so destructive about the hookup culture is precisely because it fails to acknowledge that millennials are persons, and that what it does is it reduces millennials to things to be used rather than to be loved. Now the other thing is a thing, so this is the other category. It can be used selfishly. I have a cell phone here, I can do it, I can destroy it, I can do whatever I want with it. It's property. And you don't have to love, I don't love my cell phone. And loving here is not just have an affective encounter with the thing, it's actually looking out for its needs. I don't care about my cell phone. I mean, I care for it selfishly. I don't want it to get wet because otherwise I get into trouble. I'm not really worried about whether or not it has its own particular needs. Now, it's really interesting. Where does an animal, where does a plant fall? Right? See, this is where, for ethics, where is an animal? Is it a person or is it property? And I'm going to propose to you that our culture struggles with this question. Some people treat animals like persons, and some people treat animals like property, and neither of those work. And that's where you're the problem. Because I'm going to say it's neither a person or a thing, it's a gift. And this is a radically Christian perspective. It situates lower creation within an account of how God has providentially ordered his universe. Now notice, a person has dignity, a thing has price, a gift has value. It can be used as the giver intends, right? So if my mother had given me this cell phone, I'm going to hopefully treat it very differently than if I simply had bought it on Amazon. Simply because this cell phone as gift has added value to it. It has value because it is a gift from my mom. And so part of what I do is I respect my mom in treating it well. And it is loved. I would love this cell phone now because, not only because it's a cell phone, but because it is a sign of, a manifestation of my mother's love. And so this is a question that I'm proposing. This is actually, I'm asking this question, can the category of gift help us to understand the ethics of creation care, right? And how would that radically alter the way we relate to animals? So I was talking at dinner, part of the issues for some people, animals, they treat animals like persons. And so, I was in a parish once, and the little baby pram came in, and I was, oh, wow, look. And all of a sudden, there was a puppy in there, and then the puppy was dressed up. It was getting cold, so the puppy was completely dressed up. And the puppy had a last name, and the parents were like, this is our kid, and I'm mommy, I'm daddy. Okay, so I grew up in a third world country. I've eaten dogs. So my relationship to dogs is very different from theirs. And it was very strange to me. For me, it was a distortion of the proper relationship between a person and a non-person. And I think that's a cultural difference. I think it can be exaggerated. I think there's a proper place for pets. There's a proper place for companion animals. But we have to be very careful not to distort that relationship in a way that elevates the animal to a person, right? But the other side is also a problem. If you see the animal as merely property, which can be disposed of in any which way you want to think about, that too is a problem. Because then you could treat it in any which way. The way we can treat our phones, our pencils, pens. And so the tension for creation care, especially within the Catholic moral tradition, is really seeing how we can discern what is a proper response to a gift that does not super elevate it to the point where we are conflating categories as properly associated with persons, or radically diminishing the animal or the plant so it becomes mere stuff, mere property. And you can see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we talk about that the dominion over lower creation is not absolute. It is limited by concerns for the quality of life for the neighbor, including generations to come, and requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. Now, as you're going to see, especially from the Thomistic tradition, and we were talking about this at dinner, the Thomistic tradition tends to instrumentalize animals. It's really interesting that for St. Thomas Aquinas, there will be no place in heaven for animals. None whatsoever. And because you got God. And so I think the challenge in the 21st century is to take that tradition, bring it to conversation with something like Laudato Si, see creation as a gift, and identify its proper place in how we are to treat it. So they're God's creatures, and they have, by their very nature, by their mere existence, they bless God and give him glory. So there's already a recognition, latent in Aquinas, but not explicit, where there is an independent good in the animal, in the plant, that is independent from the stewardship that we have because God has given us dominion over creation. And then here you talk about how, now I was at a conversation recently about animal research, and I was talking to several Christian ethicists who are in principle opposed to any animal research at all. And I said, and I said, well, what sort of animals? And she said, well, she's not quite sure. I said, how about yeast? Well, that's a single cell. How about mosquitoes? Okay, she can deal with mosquitoes. Worms, C. elegans, she's okay with that. But fish, well, it depends. How big are the fish? So it became very interesting. It became very interesting because it wasn't quite clear to me what the principle was for her opposition to animals. I think it had to do with a sense of sentience, a sense of suffering. And I think the idea is that there are certain animals that can suffer in a way that other animals cannot. And I deeply appreciate that. And I think the church does too. The idea is that it is legitimate to use animals for food and clothing. But again, it has to be reasonable, and you cannot cause them to suffer or die needlessly. And this is part of the issue, especially in science, because sometimes we tend to do science for the heck of it. And I think that's where we're going to have to, that's what I'm going to propose. So with a couple of just closing virtues, these are virtues that I'm just going to throw out to resist the technological imperative. The technological imperative is the following: if you can do it, do it. If we can do it, do it. And scientists are smitten by this. We want to be the first to do it. So we will do it. If we can do it, we can do it. We'll do it. And because we want to be the first to do it. And so there's some of these are virtues to try to resist that. So first is gratitude. And this is from Aquinas. It's to give thanks to our benefactors. So Aquinas has a list of what are called virtues of indebtedness. They are virtues that you have to respond to the debt that you have by the very fact that you are alive. The first one is your debt to God, which is the virtue of religion. And then you have the virtue of thanksgiving to your parents, which is piety, and to your clan or your tribe. Then there's observance, which is to people who in a sense, those who are older than you, who have responsibility, your deference to them. And finally, gratitude to all your benefactors. Now, my concern is that in a post-Christian secular world, where many of my colleagues at MIT do not believe, they have no one to thank. And when they don't have anyone to thank, then the gift is reduced to mere stuff that can be manipulated. And that's the difficulty. Humility is really important. So here the idea is that it's the habitual disposition to restrain the mind lest it tend to hide things immoderately. So this is ambition. And scientists are deeply ambitious people. And the question is, humility is an attempt to restrain that. And finally, believe it or not, magnanimity. This is to do great things. This is where I want to tell my colleagues who are not believers. We want you to do great things. So try to avoid the inconsequential little things where animals are simply killed. Plan your experiments well so you do it elegantly, beautifully, and do the best you can. So these are just kind of like three of the throwaway, the throwaway culture in which we live tend to ignore these three, which is why I wanted to bring them up. So finally, this is my last slide. This is Pope John Paul II. This is kind of like when I think about my vocation as a priest scientist, it is this. Science can purify religion from error and superstition, and science does that a lot today. But religion can purify science of idolatry and false absolutes. And I think the difficulty is that with the technological innovations of CRISPR and all of this genome editing, it has become an idol. Progress, in a sense, has become an idol. So for those of us who are believers, for those of us especially who are Christians, it is our privilege and our responsibility to always challenge that idolatry by calling our brothers and sisters to virtue. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. He turns it off.
Thanks, Father. Father Austriaco mentioned in passing, I don't know if you noticed in his own tone and his presentation, shifting gears a little bit, when he starts to suggest that he's thinking for the first time and out loud on these questions. And I think that's very important to appreciate. What so often happens in these kind of forums is there's a very well-plowed field on a topic, and you have academics that have committed their entire lives to highly specialized discourse, and then they get an evening where they're able to share their expertise. That's not the case tonight. Not that we don't have highly specialized and talented academics, but that this conversation has not yet happened in the Catholic Christian community. We're not really sure what to do about the status of creatures and lower creation, and CRISPR is only going to force that conversation. So for someone of the esteem of Father Austriaco, who is an expert in his discipline, to come to our community and step out into an area where there isn't a lot of mastery or expertise yet, that's kind of risky business, and I appreciate very much your willingness to help us think this through. I think the same thing's going to be the case with John as well, Dr. Berkman and Professor Hellman. We didn't pick these people because we think they're going to give us the right answer. We picked these people because we think they're going to help us contribute to the common conversation. It's uncharted water. I think that's important. Although I do think they'll give us the right answer. I probably should have put it that way. Okay, Professor John Berkman was born in Ottawa, Canada, to a family of physicians, the youngest of 3 children. After completing his undergraduate studies at the University of Toronto, where his teachers included some of the most distinguished scholars, including Joseph Boyle, John Finnis, Oliver O'Donovan, and Northrop Frye, he did his doctoral studies at Duke University under the direction of Stanley Hauerwas, graduating in 1994. He taught in the United States, Washington, D.C., Connecticut, Berkeley, California, for 16 years, teaching almost exclusively at the graduate level before returning to Canada in 2009. He's published widely in the field of moral theology, Christian ethics, and has taught healthcare ethics throughout his career. He's lectured throughout the United States and much of Europe and in Southern Africa. In 2017, he was a visiting research scholar at Christ Church College and at Blackfriars, Oxford. He is married to a palliative care physician and the father of 3. Please welcome John Berkman.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to share some reflections on this important topic. I'm also worried this might test my skills because I have to both push this and push a button on my computer to change the slide. So I hope I won't get confused and be speaking about one slide while showing you a different one. All right. I want to thank Father Nicanor. There were so many fascinating points in his talk I would love to pick up on, but I won't be able to because of my allotted time. So the title for my presentation is Loving God and Loving All Our Neighbors. And I hope at some point that will become clear why that is my title. Push the right button. No. Will this one work? Oh yeah, great. Okay, here we go. Yep. So far I'm in good shape. So I take it this is the basic moral question for tonight's discussion. Now, the first thing I think to be said is that there's no neutral way of answering this question. In other words, there is no objectively correct answer to this question that we can derive from some allegedly pure rational thinking. Our answer will derive in part from our fundamental moral convictions, some of which I think are certainly more defensible than others. So what I'm going to do in my allotted time, for most of it, is to step back and ask more fundamental questions as to how we think about ourselves, our fellow human beings, our fellow creatures, and how all of them and us relate to the source and end of all creatures, that is, God. So, beginning with a few basic questions. First, I want to suggest that we see our fellow creatures as our neighbors. I take it that this is not too far a stretch, since Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, speaking of our common home, already sees other non-human animals as our housemates. Following Pope Francis, I want to say that God, the author of all creation, loves all creatures. Each and every creature glorifies God in its very mode of existing. And every species of creature, and this is shared by St. Thomas, contributes to the perfection of God's world. I further want to say that we only love other, what I will call non-human animals. First of all, because St. Thomas says we are also animals. In fact, interestingly, St. Thomas, when he wants to give an example of a self-evident proposition, he says that humans are animals. But that's another question beyond, but something we might reflect on. And every species of creatures contributes to the perfections of God's world, I said. Now, about love, we only love non-human animals if we see them as God sees them and relate to them as God would have us relate to them. And I believe our fundamental stance must be one of love. All right. As Christians who understand that God loves not only human animals, but other animals as well, our first responsibility in speaking and writing about other animals is to understand and communicate God's story about them. That story, as I understand it, is first and foremost a story of God's providential love and concern for each species of animal, including the individuals of each species. We see this in multiple comments by Jesus in the Gospels and elsewhere in Scripture. Central to God's providential love is that each species has its own divinely ordained ends. On this understanding, part of human stewardship of our fellow creatures consists in seeking to understand the flourishing of various species and the conditions under which various species flourish. And thus, when possible, if we are to love other non-human animals, to facilitate or at least seek to avoid diminishing the capacity of all of God's creatures to flourish according to their kind. Thus, my argument is this: we must see each and every species of non-human animal the way God sees them. That is, to see them as creatures of God who manifest God's goodness and give praise to God in their flourishing as creatures of diverse natures. So, if we are thus faithful to God and God's creation, we recognize our need to support their praises of God by supporting their flourishing. So let's first talk about love of God and love of the ordinary neighbor, so to speak. True love of my neighbor is to love him or her in relation to his or her true good. Secondly, to act in relation to my neighbor in terms of my needs or wants is not to love him or her. Father Nicanor brought this up because this is to instrumentalize him or her. It's not to see him or her with intrinsic goodness which must be respected. Now, I want to say, of course, we can interact with our friends or those who entertain us or our colleagues and business associates in ways that serve our good, but such relationships should be ones of reciprocity, where I signal to those I interact with that I have a fundamental respect for him or her, and in our relationships, as well as my own good, I seek their good as well, a common good, which I believe is your motto. Our other neighbors. No, I'm not speaking about the annoying people who live down the street. Pope Francis's Laudato Si, I believe, is a massive breakthrough in thinking about our relationships with God's other creatures. First, and this is very, very important, it is the first authoritative statement from the Catholic Church that unequivocally and emphatically teaches the independent and intrinsic goodness of non-human animals. There are lots of other documents that might point to it, but this is the first one that completely, clearly, and unequivocally says it. In other words, God created the world for them as well. It's not just for us. The rest of creation is not simply a backdrop on the stage which we get to do everything. It's not just our world from God's perspective. Furthermore, in Laudato Si, there is no language of hierarchy. Now, if other creatures have this intrinsic good, this intrinsic dignity, then we cannot simply instrumentalize them simply for our own purposes. We must seek their true and authentic good. But this is rather a complicated question, because what is the intrinsic good of a bat, or a chimpanzee, or a duck, or a Komodo dragon, and so on and so forth? Pope Francis speaks theologically about non-human animals in a remarkably Trinitarian way. He says, God the Father loves animals into existence and continues to love them, tenderly caring for them. He goes on, Jesus loves every non-human animal and guides each one of them to their heavenly home. And he says the Holy Spirit dwells in every animal. He explicitly says all this in Laudato Si. Furthermore, Pope Francis makes clear that only by being in relationship to God and to other non-human animals can we mature as believers. He says we must be in proper communion with other animals, with non-human animals, if we are to be in proper communion with God. From my perspective, who has thought about non-human animals for many years as a Catholic, frankly, these statements are simply mind-boggling and wonderful from my perspective. Here, I believe that Pope Francis has given us a basis for a whole Catholic theology regarding non-human animals, and has given us, those of us who want to think theologically about non-human animals, lots and lots of work to do. Okay, moving to the particular. The picture is of my son Jack and Dr. Jones, who we just typically call Jones or Jonesy. He is now an 8-month-old Newfoundland dog. When we got him 6 months ago, he weighed about 12 pounds, and now he weighs somewhere between 95 and 100 pounds. That was 6 months. And he's still growing. Now, my remark, we cannot love animals, is a reference to a quote from the brothers Karamazov and the wise Father Zosima. And in the book, he reports of an elderly man saying, "I love mankind," he said, "but I am amazed at myself. The more I love mankind in general, the less I love people in particular, that is, individually, as separate persons." I think this seems also to be true of loving other creatures. I think there are many animal rights activists who actually don't like specific animals, would never dream of having a pet, and not because they are morally opposed to it. But I'll leave that aside. So, continuing back to my question about what is the flourishing of any particular species, and how we might love them according to their nature, we might ask, so how do I love Jones? First, it begins by wanting the best for him. In many ways, it's the simple and mundane practices of a devoted dog owner. Taking him to the vet, keeping him from running out on the road, or eating things that will harm him, providing him with food and lots of love. Dogs are made happy almost entirely by the sensation of touch. So a lot of belly rubs by my children. Now, of course, one of the problems with many dog owners is they don't actually treat them as dogs according to the nature of dogs, but rather treat them more like human beings, which is a disaster both for them and for the dog. But I can't get into that, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to. So this raised the question, what can I do to really love God's creatures? Well, as St. Thomas says, you can only love something, an individual, to the extent that you know that person. So how do we do that? I say by becoming a theological ethologist. Now, this is my fancy and pretentious way of talking about our coming to know a particular species and a particular creature of God. In other words, understanding a particular species in light of its own authentic natural and supernatural good, understood as flourishing according to its very nature. And then once we have an increased understanding, to integrate that knowledge with God's intrinsic concern for that species and that particular animal. For it is only in my thinking clearly and deeply about a particular species that I will be able to articulate the particular good of Jones as a dog. Now, as I come to a deeper understanding, I will be better able to make concrete proposals about promoting the good, or at least avoiding continued egregious harm, to both Jones and dogs more generally, in relation to both Jones and also other dogs' specific ways of honoring God in their very being. Okay, I want to broaden out for a moment and then come back to the question at hand, which you're probably wondering what happened to. I believe that our meeting God in an authentic religious experience must begin not with control, but in reception and relationship, a recognition of that which is infinitely greater and wiser than us. Now we see, for example, as John Paul II spoke about in Veritatis Splendor, such an encounter may begin with an encounter with Christ himself. But we can also come to meet God in God's creation. Now, this notion of religious experience, I believe we see talked about in Scripture in terms of the holy places where we are more likely to meet God. Now, at least since St. Augustine, we have understood that our receiving the world begins with beauty. What he says is the source of all our desires. And I believe to see God's creation and other non-human animals adequately, we must both see them in their beauty and their mystery. And I want to say a little bit about each of those very briefly. The great 20th century theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, in his massive work in theology, begins with beauty. Now, he doesn't want to begin with some doctrine about beauty, but rather acknowledging the primacy of our experience of being grasped by and grasping the beautiful. Beauty is not something we need to puzzle out. As he says, it brings with it a self-evidence that enlightens without mediation. We are struck by it. We are drawn to it. And I believe if we see in other non-human animals and other creatures the divine beauty, I wonder, will we be eager to deface it or destroy it? Furthermore, God's creation has a form, what Pope Benedict calls a grammar. Now, this grammar of creation provides criteria for how we live well in relation to our common home. So I've said a bit about beauty and about mystery. So when I say that Jones, or another animal, say a particular chimpanzee, is a mystery, I'm not saying that Jones is unknown to me, although he may well be very much unknown to me. But my point is rather, I'm saying that Jones, or this particular chimpanzee I might meet, has infinite depth, as do other human beings. One is never finished with any creature if one sees it the way God sees it. For from God into Jones flows a never-failing replenishment of sense and significance that I always only at best know in some small part. That, I think, is in part what it means for a creature to have intrinsic significance. Okay. So finally, back to the question. So how might we think about genetic modification of other creatures? Now, I'm not going to try to get into the details of that in any sense, and I want to rather raise a couple of reflections on the ethics of experimentation more generally, both on humans and on other animal species. Now, if you know anything about how basically medical experimentation in this country works, you'll know that it is mostly the poor, the least of these, those who need the money, who submit to experiments. And I might add that when I was in my graduate school program, my first 2 years, my roommate from Scotland, who was broke, was a regular guinea pig at Duke University Hospital. He's now a full professor at Yale. Rather change in social standing. Now, of course, when it is overwhelming the least of these in our society who get experimented on, the least powerful, one can expect that the ethics of experimentation might have some problematic aspects. Now, I might mention a man who is famous, or rather infamous perhaps, depending on your perspective, in the Twin Cities, Carl Elliott, who wrote a very important book called, I believe, White Coat, Black Hat, about the underclass of those who get experimented on in our society, in the American medical scene. Now, it was in my 4th year as an undergrad at University of Toronto, I took a course on the ethics of experimentation. And recognizing that we'd like to experiment on the poor, we'd like to experiment on prisoners in penitentiaries, and other people who are really disempowered, I argued that all experimentation should only be done on those who have been drafted, a lottery, so to speak, because if we did it randomly and by lottery, then, for example, if I knew that me or my spouse or my children might have to participate in these experiments, we would make sure that they had appropriate levels of danger and were not inappropriately being done and risking the lives and health of people inappropriately. It was also in that course that my topic to present on was experimenting on non-human animals, which, when I took that course in 1985, it was still very widespread doing a test for cosmetics by putting them in rabbits' eyes and figuring out what percentage of the rabbits were blinded by the cosmetic. All right. And so I think we can think analogously about experimentation on, on other animals. Let me see okay. Now, so one of the things we might ask is, well, would I want this experiment on an animal to be something that Jones would undergo? And I don't say this in a kind of romanticized way. And of course, the question that always gets raised, and it's a serious question, an important question, and I respect it, is what of all the good that comes out of experimenting on animals, even if they do have intrinsic dignity? Now, of course, one of the obvious answers is producing good never justifies actions that are evil, if they are evil. And so we have to be able to think about it more adequately than from a kind of utilitarian calculation. So, is the genetic engineering of other creatures wrong? Now, I want to raise an analogy, and this is an analogy, so it's important. I am not claiming that experimenting on human animals and non-human animals is the same or has the same moral significance. But I do, going back to my example, if this human experiment was to be done on my spouse or my child or my friend, would I think it acceptable? And I think we may ask analogously about those animals that we know, that we may love. Would we want such tests done on them? Or would we find that acceptable, even if unpleasant? And again, this is not simply an appeal to feelings, but I believe an appeal to well-trained affection, understanding the morally important in the particular, as what Augustine says, to order our loves appropriately. And I believe if we've learned to properly come to know other creatures, to know how they flourish, we are going to be in a better perspective to think wisely and to discern well about the ethics of such genetic engineering. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Lots of provocative elements in that presentation. I'm certain we'll be able to circle back on the Q. I would like to hand the floor over to our third speaker then, Professor Jessica Hellman, whose bio is on the back of this note saying you have 2 more minutes. I'm sure glad you didn't tear this up and throw this away. Jessica Hellman earned her PhD in biology from Stanford University and served as postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation at the University of British Columbia Center for Biodiversity Research. She's an alum of Stanford Leopold Leadership Program and a recipient of a Career Enhancement Fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. She currently serves as director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. In this capacity, provides overall strategic leadership for the Institute, an internationally recognized organization working to solve grand environmental challenges while promoting interdisciplinary research, teaching, and leadership across the university and engaging external partners and stakeholders. The bio goes on much, much longer, but in the interest of time, we'll put a pause there. I just do want to say, I run in circles with Father Austriaco and John, and so it wasn't unusual when I call them up, they'd be willing to come and offer their reflections. But Jessica we'd never met before, and so to essentially meet a complete stranger at the University of Minnesota, of all places, and to be received so welcomed and so open-minded and so willing to engage a community on this important discourse is just a tribute to your character. So thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you're having a good time. I certainly am. I've also been scribbling on the back of my paper a lot of thoughts and observations I've been sharing with Chris as I listen to these remarks. So thank you so much to the Murphy Institute and to Dr. Thompson for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you all this evening. And I just want to remind us all, at least Chris, when he extended an invitation to me about this evening, he said, we want to discuss how science has dramatically increased our ability to intervene in the natural order of creatures and their environment. And we want to make some ethical and moral sense of that ability. And I was really inspired by this concept of what it means to intervene in the natural order of creatures in the environment. So I want to share with you a kind of extended case study or application of genetic modification and a reason why we might go about doing it. And my hope and intention is it'll give us something to hold on to as we think about some of the issues that my colleagues have raised already. Now, you heard from Father Austriaco about the technology of genetic modification, including, most importantly, CRISPR, and that we are modifying other organisms, other plants and animals, often for our own benefit. CRISPR is very specific and very targeted. It is a very powerful technology. It has potential application across the plant and animal kingdoms. It's remarkably precise, and it's becoming more and more cost effective. That's why it's sweeping the fields of medicine and agriculture, but it's also extending into some other areas. And I want to talk to you about an area outside of medicine and agriculture. And I want to play up on this concept. It will end up playing up on Dr. Berkman's concept of flourishing that he mentioned at the end of his remarks. Now, why might we go about modifying plants and animals outside of ag and medicine? We might do that because we are modifying our planet in a dangerous way. And we might intervene as humans to counteract those negative effects. And that intervention, counteracting our dangerous change on one side with intervention on the other side, might be effective and justified. Climate change is what I'm speaking of. Our modification of the planet in a disastrous way. It is one and only one way that we are massively, globally modifying the Earth, and this has negative outcomes for people and other species. Many of you may have seen this figure before. It's becoming one of the most widely shown scientific figures. This is the amount of warming that we can expect under a business-as-usual scenario of continued emissions of greenhouse gases. This is actually the trajectory that we're on, and there isn't a lot of evidence of us rapidly shifting off of it. So this is our future in 60 to 80 years. In this future, the globe would warm on average about 6 degrees C or 11 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 or 11 degrees Fahrenheit. And that amount of climate change might not sound like much, but it matters a lot to biology. The last time the Earth was about 6 degrees cooler was during the last ice age, and Death Valley, California was an evergreen forest, for example. And the last time that CO2 concentration was comparable to the what I showed on the previous slide, there were relatives of alligators at the poles. So our future in the next several decades is comparable to massive biological change. If we zoom into that graph and look close to home here in Minnesota, our end-of-century future could also be actually on the warmer end of this global average. Plus, we'll see greater extremes and a longer growing season. So I think you can simply think about how much that would affect the species that live here. And there's a really large literature, a literature that I'm part of, that diagnoses the effects of this climate change on people and on our planet. For our purposes tonight, I'd like you to take my word for it that it's a big deal. And that the consequences are becoming increasingly known to us and much more often negative than positive, often because the creatures that we share this planet and the human systems that we have built were set for our historic average climate and not for this rapidly changing climate. So what do we do about this problem of dangerous climate change and its impact on environmental systems and other natural systems? The most important thing that we must do has nothing to do with CRISPR. It has to do with stopping the change from happening in the first place. We must stop emitting greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and how do we do that? We must have an economic revolution in energy, transportation, and agriculture, and we need that very quickly. But that revolution may not happen, or it may not happen quickly enough. And harmful amounts of climate change are already taking place. And that will continue until our economic revolution comes to pass. And in that time, creatures will be placed at risk. I think we have a moral duty of stewardship to other life on Earth, like this endangered Kerner blue butterfly, to do what we can to prevent the harms of climate and other environmental changes, to allow this creature to flourish in its way, in its habitat, and not to play a role in speeding its demise. That stewardship duty through species and ecosystems extends indirectly to humanity. We must protect natural ecosystems for the good that they do for people, the irreplaceable ecosystem services that they provide. So in addition to transforming our economy, there are a variety of tools at our disposal to help species withstand climate change. And these tools include a variety of traditional approaches in conservation, things like setting aside land, but there also are some more highly interventionist approaches that are available to us. And as we increasingly confront and realize the massive problem that we face, we will increasingly look to these more interventionist techniques, and we need to be able to make sense of when and how they are appropriate. So here's one idea that's been talked about, I've written about as well. It would fall into the more sort of highly interventionist category. It's a strategy called managed relocation. And perhaps you can get the sense from this cartoon. It's about moving species from where they have historically occurred to new locations where they can survive in a future warmer climate. Genetic modification would also fall under this highly interventionist approach, where we could genetically manipulate species to enhance their performance under climate change through breeding or other techniques, just like we breed desirable traits in crops, like in these apples, for example. We could select for traits like heat or drought tolerance. Now, this modification does not have to be high-tech. It could be traditional breeding. It could be introducing beneficial genes into a natural population. But new technologies like CRISPR may allow that breeding to be more specific, more tailored, and possibly more effective. So what virtues or principles should guide us in thinking about intervening in natural processes in an attempt to undo harms like climate change? As Chris alluded, I don't have the answer to that question, but I ask it quite a lot, and I'd like for you all to think of it. If someone has the right answer, it'd be lovely if you could point it out. But here are some of the virtues or some of the principles that I think are important as we evaluate these more interventionist strategies in the name of conservation. There are many positive, laudable virtues that would cause us to intervene, including the use of genetics. One is that duty of stewardship, concern for current and future humans who benefit from and depend on biodiversity, and refusing to stand by, but instead take action in response to a known and conspicuous problem. But there are negatives as well, notably the hubris implicit in intervention and the inevitable unintended consequences and side effects that will happen as a consequence of that intervention. Also, because our intervention will always be limited ultimately by time and resources, we are essentially faced with a form of triage, preferring some species and ecosystems over others. Furthermore, that intervention, even as the cost of CRISPR comes down, will require money, and some group of people will have to bear that expense. And with the larger amounts of climate change, and the more technologically sophisticated our techniques are in confronting it, the higher that cost will be. Now, let me be clear that for the most part, these more interventionist strategies to confront climate change, like genetic modification and managed relocation, are really not occurring now, at least not on a large scale. But if the pace of climate change continues, and it seems like it will, the need for and call for those actions will grow. Now, there are other motivations for genetic manipulations in the name of conservation that are using techniques in modern biology more than just for climate change. And many of those are about restoring the genetic diversity of endangered or threatened species. Work, for example, is underway right now in the American chestnut and in the black-footed ferret, among others. Now, I'm a fairly practical person, So I think a good approach to evaluating intervention, thinking about what are we going to do, is about carefully balancing pros and cons, and that thinking about what are the good reasons in comparison to the bad, as well as our moral responsibilities informed by a variety of perspectives. I do think that science is critical to that evaluation as well, because research can help evaluate the efficacy, the benefits, and the risks of intervention, of different intervention strategies, including genetic modification. But science alone will not give us the answers. We all must engage in these kinds of questions, especially around climate change, because we are all culpable for climate change. So it's not just a question of the appropriateness of the intervention, but the necessity that we have caused for us to even consider that intervention. As the impacts of climate change accrue in natural systems, we should not stand idly by, but we also cannot be foolhardy in our approach. Our decisions about where and how to intervene are an expression of our technological capacity and capability, but also our core values. So again, I hope here are some values that I hope that we bring to the table. A value of stewardship, the value of making decisions with scientific evidence, the value of skepticism and anticipation of side effects, and a value about fairness and equity. I think these are all crucial to our guiding our use of genetic modification for climate change and conservation. And I would like for us to sort of debate how those might come to be. Now, importantly, one thing I hope above all others is that just thinking about how daunting intervention may be, will be, actually brings us back to where we should start. And that is getting serious about addressing climate change at its source. And that source is us. And when I say us, I mean specifically us, Americans, Minnesotans. Our contribution to climate change is massive. Upwards of a third of climate change to date lies at the feet of Americans, and yet we have just 4% of the world's population. Each day, the average American and the average Minnesotan contributes more than 2 times the greenhouse gases of the average Chinese and 9.5 times the average Indian. That culpability means that we are the ones asking the rest of the world to adjust to climate change, including the use of genetic modification. And unleashing genetic modification to undo the harms of climate change is essentially a rich person's solution to a rich person's problem. And this strikes me as unbalanced and unfair to the poor around the world who are vastly less responsible for climate change in the first place. Now, I acknowledge that we are unlikely to stop doing genetic and genomic research, and we should not forsake the potential use of this technology in addressing climate change or other problems. But I hope that greater awareness of the power and responsibility of intervention invites us to take a closer look at our moral obligations to nature, our role in the biosphere, the importance of prioritizing, and the virtue of humility. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have opportunities for question and answer. We have a couple of microphones in the far corner that are making their way into the central aisles. If you've got a question you'd like to ask one of our panelists or comment on the conversation generally, you're more than welcome to.
Hello.
Hi.
Father Nicanor, you articulated 3 categories for thinking about these issues: the things, the gifts, and the persons. And I was wondering if, Dr. Berkman, you used the language of neighbors instead, and if you, Dr. Berkman, were to translate your thinking into Dr. Nicanor's language, so to speak, would you say that non-human animals are things, gifts, or persons, or would you prefer not to use his categorization at all?
That's a great question. Is this one?
I don't know.
He's on now.
Okay. Thank you. That's a great question. I thought a bit about that when Father Nicanor was speaking. No, that's not a set of categories I think I would be comfortable taking on, in part because we humans are gifts fundamentally. I mean, our children are gifts from God. So I'm concerned about the restriction of gift language to non-human animals, because I do think theologically both are creation by God and our salvation from God are both fundamentally gifts. So I want to keep that language, have a wider application. But I don't have a kind of a set of general categories that I would want to slot each into. I think at this point, I think in many ways it has to be thought through more piecemeal.
Mitch?
I thank you all for speaking tonight. I am left resonating with many of the points made, but the devil is always in the details. And Dr. Berkman, hearing you talk, a respect for beauty and awe resonates with me. And when you think of applying the golden rule, it's easy for me to do. But then, Father, as we start thinking of things and people and gifts, there's a sense in which ultimately we're all different kinds of gifts. The materials that make the chairs are gifts, and we're, in a sense, gifts for each other. And then as I think of what we're preserving, under an evolutionary paradigm, there's just a sense where ultimately things aren't static. There's some fluidity. At least in the long, long term, there's a sense in which nothing is really stable. So I'm left wondering, as we try to apply the golden rule in more detail, and as we try to appreciate the giftedness of individual things, I'm left wondering, what exactly are we trying to preserve here? I know it's a very broad question, but how do we try to get more detail? Are there any steps we can take?
I think it's a terrific question. I think each of us would probably have something different to say in response to that. On the question of what is preservation for, or what is our obligation under a preservation framing, given that at least biological systems are constantly evolving and changing. In fact, most species that ever lived on Earth do not live today, right? Many more things have gone extinct than currently live. That said, we have more species on Earth now than we have ever had in the past. I think in that particular sense, we can look at that, for me, a very important component of why preservation in the face of something like climate change is important is ultimately one about culpability. It's about a biological process, a background rate of extinction and natural evolutionary change that is rapidly accelerated because of a human process, a process that we are aware of and know that is detrimental to other creatures and to ourselves. So I think in addition to acting in response to something we are culpable for, there's also an instrumental reason which simply says that the erosion of biodiversity that we're causing is detrimental to our own well-being. And that also extends to our moral and spiritual obligations to other creatures, but also to one another. That releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere actually hurts people, partially through the diminishment of nature, but also directly. And I think that it's the fact that we cause it and the fact that we understand its cause that necessitates our efforts to do biodiversity conservation.
Thanks, that's a great question. I was first struck by your use of the word stable, that nothing's really stable. Well, that is true, but it's also false. I mean, stability, let's put it this way. Global warming itself isn't a problem. It's the speed at which it's going on. I mean, throughout evolutionary history, I take it the planet's always been going up or down in temperature, but it's never, as far as we know, ever been going at this rate. And if it goes at a much slower rate, then various species can evolve to address. But when climate change is going on at this rate, for most, that's just not possible. So I do think what we see here is this human-caused, unprecedented change that I think is will cause a greater extinction of species at a rate that's, as far as I know, not been seen in evolutionary history, though I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but from, I do think there's enough stability both in our evolutionary history that we can speak of stable species and their ends and their goods, although evolution does raise some interesting questions, which I think can be addressed. Again, I would say it really means what we mean by stability.
For me to respond to your question, I think it comes down to that example where we're genetically humanizing pigs in order to provide transplantable organs to patients who are dying, right? So that's, if you want to come down to let's have a very concrete particular, you want to talk about particular, that's where the ethics is going to have to come to. Because in many ways, pigs were never created or designed to become organ donors for people. And so when Dr. Berkman talks about its own end or its flourishing, this is the furthest thing from a pig's flourishing, precisely because when we eventually do this, and we are doing this right now, that pig is never going to go out into the wild. Because when we create that pig is going to be raised completely in a sanitary environment, so it will never get infected by anything that could potentially make the recipient of the organ sick. So you're going to have an animal that is basically never going to go out in nature. So now the question is, how does our ethics address that? So if you say, well, okay, and this is where I think the discussion has got to be, if there is an intrinsic good that can never be subordinated to the human good. So this is the account that the tension in the Catholic moral tradition. If there is an intrinsic good that can never be subordinated to the human good, then you could never do this to these animals at all. Right. That's how I see it. That it comes down to that. And so if you are going to justify that technology in order to save the lives of people who need organ transplants, then you are going to have to say that whatever this good of an animal is, and it has a good, it can always be subordinated to the human good in a reasonable way. And that's really, for me, for this big debate, is really about that question. If there is I think, as Dr. Berkman pointed out, there was it was latent in the tradition. Laudato Si brought it up explicitly, that animals have intrinsic good. The question is really, can that be subordinated? Because we have intrinsic goods, and part of the thing is we cannot be subordinated. There are ways that we cannot be used for another. Our goods can never be subordinated to another human being's goods. And there's a debate, of course, of how this works, because things happen in life where this possibly could happen. But we say we're all intrinsically equal. Our intrinsic dignity makes it such that we're equal. Are we saying that human beings and human animals and non-human animals have an intrinsic dignity that is equal, so it can never be subordinated? And if that's the case, that technology, where you're creating pigs humanizing pigs genetically in order for them to become sources of human transplantable organs would actually be intrinsically evil. It would be very similar to slavery, right? And so that's the kind of question we're asking right now. And, because we say slavery is subordinating one human being's good to another. And we say you cannot do that. Well, this is what we're being faced with. And I think this is where the tradition has to go. And there are individuals who will say that the animal's good will never be able to be subordinated to the point where you can't even eat them. And others who say it can be completely subordinated. And the reason why I brought up gift between these two is to try to reveal there's this tension and try to figure out where this tension lies.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think that's one of the intriguing things about the conservation application and why I raised it is because is it possible that some of these genetic modification techniques could not be used in service of animals being subordinated under human wishes, but actually a tool that is used to advance flourishing?
Thank you. You'll notice as Father Austriaco was answering, he glanced up at me for a second, which I take it to be, Chris, you're a moral theologian. Why don't you say something? And just to offer this perspective, I think there'd have to be a proportionate good. It's not that it's intrinsically disordered to modify creatures. It's just that you'd have to have a proportionate good. And obviously then the debate of what constitutes proportion. But it seems to me modifying pigs for the sake of heart transplants, at least at first blush, would meet that criteria. Does that open up the door to all kinds of modification? No. And you'd have to have a proportionate good.
Yeah, this may be a substantive disagreement between Father Nicanor and myself. Father Nicanor is looking at the ethical issue as it's either equivocal or it's univocal. They're either the same thing or they're different. And I'm trying to argue that we should think about it analogically. And so I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is the pig virus is probably originated in factory farming conditions where you have huge numbers of pigs put together. So getting rid of the virus in the pig sounds like it's for the pig. It's not for the pig. It's so you can continue to put pigs in unbelievably cruel conditions and make more money off of them. Because if they get these viruses and you have to separate them and actually give them more humane living conditions, well, that would hurt the bottom line. So one of the things we should be wary about is whether, in fact, what sounds like, oh, getting rid of the pig virus is good for the pigs, it actually has nothing to do with the concern for the flourishing and welfare of pigs. I also think we need to make distinctions between things that we need and things we don't. So, for example, I would have absolutely no problem with in cultures where there is simply no way to get non-animal food that is perfectly acceptable to hunt animals if they're needed for survival. But in the North American context, where we can very easily live without eating animals, very easily and more cheaply and more environmentally responsible, and considering that between 80 for cows and 95 or higher for chickens, they're raised under conditions that are clearly cruel, which is clearly forbidden in the Catholic tradition, then all of us, when we're eating factory farmed animals, are participating in that cruelty, and I consider that a form of cooperation with evil, which is unacceptable. But the one other thing I want to add with Father Nicanor is partly this question of putting pigs in humans presupposes a whole series of prior decisions we've made. What if all the resources, all the money that we do into doing this on animals, we rather looked into various technologies for cellular improvement, replacement in hearts themselves without going to animals? Might we have as good or better outcomes? But once you go down the technological fix, then well, it's the pig. Oh, well, now you need to get the viruses and other things and other things. So I want us to step back and say, does this, what seems just like a huge casuistical problem that we have to answer, I want us to step back and look at all the kinds of other assumptions that have gone on to produce that quandary, because quandaries always have backgrounds, and I think there could be better directions to go that wouldn't have to create these quandaries. I'm not saying that we might never have to kill animals for legitimate reasons, but the pig hearts, I think, presumes a background that we need to be much more critical about.
I think we'll have time for maybe one more question. This gentleman here.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of just, first I'm just kind of curious whether eliminating an entire species would ever be compatible with respecting their flourishing, even in a mosquito. But I was kind of just following up on the question you were referring to the factory farms and so forth. And when the third speaker, I apologize, I forgot your name. But when you talked about intervention in animals to combat climate change, the first thing that sprung to mind was like, well, what if there was some sort of genetic intervention that could change the dietary or the digestive system of cows so that they produce less methane? Because obviously that's a major contributor to climate change. But then the thought is like, well, then in doing so, I mean, we already have, to kind of combine it with the last remarks, we already have a problem where we're consuming far too many cows than we ought to be, just intrinsically, right? The CAFOs are just a big problem. The factory farming, that's a horrible thing that we're doing anyway, and it contributes to climate change. Well, what would happen if we were to sort of take interventions to reduce that latter effect? Would that thereby encourage more of these kinds of problematic consumption habits that we have?
So I'll just respond to the very first question. So have we ever eradicated a biological species before? We have. So smallpox does not exist. It's a viral species. It's gone. There are two remaining samples, one CDC in Atlanta and the other one in Moscow because of the Cold War. So it's really striking because my students will ask the question, well, is it a good thing that we eradicated smallpox? That we completely destroyed an entire species of virus and because of that, there is no more smallpox. So, and it makes us pause, because I think a lot of people will say, well, we can do that with viruses, not mosquitoes, not rats. And I think that this is what I brought up earlier, where I was talking to someone who was opposed to animal research. So where exactly do we draw the line? Is it a principle-based one? So I think in her case, it had to do with some notion of sentience, which makes sense. But when people raise the point that we should never, ever eradicate a biological species on principle, I say we've already done that. And we're trying to do that with polio, and we're trying to do that with some of the really, really nasty viral and bacterial species that we can get our hands on. So now we're attempting to do with mosquitoes. And so my concern actually is not that in principle it would be bad or good. My concern is we have no idea what will happen if you eradicate an entire species of mosquito. The ecological, the interconnectivity of the biosphere is so intricate that I would be concerned that you knock out some mosquito and now some other insect that needed the mosquito for something is now dead too, and the whole thing falls apart. The thing with viruses is that we kind of knew we were the only ones that it was trying to get at.
I would add on the, could you engineer a cow that released less methane? And your point that suddenly you end up with these chains of, well, if you did this, you could address this problem, and they tend to be technological in nature. I guess one of the things that's most provocative for me, thinking generally about what it means to manipulate species and ecosystems to help them adjust to climate change, is that it brings you into this kind of two wrongs make a right kind of conundrum. And that ultimately, if you think about it very deeply, it brings you back around to maybe we should consume less cows. I think there's great power in that, and that's why I think talking about these kinds of issues, even being willing to dream about techno fixes, can cause us to remember the simpler answers. Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to add one aspect on the extinction. I want to come at it from the other end than Father Nicanor. I believe we're on the verge of making a certain species of rhino extinct. Hominins, all humans and all the other higher apes, there used to be a lot of species of hominins, and most of them have got extinct. And we're the only one that is successful, human beings. And there's good reason to believe in the next 40 or 50 years, chimpanzees in the wild, bonobos, and many other species will go extinct at the rate that we're destroying their habitats and they're being hunted, et cetera, et cetera. We could probably speak of many others, and I apologize for taking particularly African examples because for a variety of reasons I think that's really unjust to start there, but largely because of our impact on those cultures. But, and I think, so I have no problem per se. Obviously species come and go, but I think for us, through a whole series of completely selfish reasons, destroy habitats of so many species and cause many of these majestic creatures, and the beauty of which I think is self-evident, would be highly immoral. So I think it depends a lot about what species, in my view, we're talking about.
Thank you. Only in Minnesota would you get a couple hundred people in the middle of winter staying late into the evening debating ethical treatment of mosquitoes. It's pretty close to our state bird, I suppose. What a wonderful conversation. Before we close with a round of raucous applause for our guests, I want to add a couple of things. Tomorrow, a smaller version of this will be going on at the Anselm House. Where's Andrew? Andrew Hansen and the Anselm House. Can you shout an address to us?
Yes, 1337 Cleveland Avenue North, which is right across from the St. Paul campus. And that'll be an undergraduate-focused conversation.
An undergraduate-focused.
St. Thomas undergrad.
Sure. At Anselm House. At what time?
At 4 o'clock.
Okay, 4 o'clock. A little reprisal of some of the conversation. And then I'm wondering if we could end the evening just with a little doxology and we all together sing a song. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy